"You're worth more than gold," the rancher told her. "But how does a woman endure being traded like livestock, swapped for a pen of pigs by her own kin, treated as less than human, as if her life held no value? And could such a woman, scarred by humiliation, ever find a love deep enough to heal those wounds and rewrite the ending of her story?" The autumn fair in Dry Hollow carried the smells of roasted corn and livestock, the mingled laughter of children and the coarse jokes of men too long without shame. In the middle of that noise stood Clara, 50 years old, her frame broad, her dress patched, and her chin held steady as if bracing against a storm. Her brother-in-law, drunk again, dragged her by the arm toward the pig pens. His boots slipped in the dust, his words slurred with desperation. "A debt's a debt," he croaked, pulling her forward like she was a mule to be haggled over. At the gate, Cole Hargreave, the slaughterman, with a face hard as a cleaver, leaned against the rail. "No money, then the pen will do. A woman for a pen of pigs." He laughed, and others joined the sound, sharp as glass. Eyes turned toward Clara, not with pity, but with the sick curiosity of people watching a fire they didn't intend to stop. She felt the sting of their stares like burrs in her skin. She had carried this body through winters and funerals, through kitchens where her labor was taken for granted, through nights when a husband's scorn was heavier than his touch. She had endured, but never had she been bartered so openly, like a side of beef weighed against squealing livestock. Her shawl, thin mended, smelling faintly of lavender, was the only armor she had. She pulled it closer, not to hide, but to remind herself she was still more than this. Cole spat in the dirt. "She's strong enough to cook, to clean, to keep a house. You'll call it square." The brother-in-law nodded eagerly, sweat dripping down his temple. The deal was almost done. Clara spoke, then her voice even cutting through the jeers. "I am not a debt. I am not a bargain to settle over pigs. I am a woman who has paid her share in work and in silence. If you trade me like an animal, that's a debt you'll owe God." The crowd hushed, not out of respect, but out of shock that she dared speak. Some smirked, others sneered. One boy whispered, "Big woman's got a big mouth." Cole stepped closer, his breath sour, his eyes small and cruel. "You don't get a say, big lady, not here." The words should have crushed her. Instead, they struck an old bruise, one already hardened by years of ridicule. She had been called worse. She had survived worse. Without another glance, Clara turned from the pens. She walked past the stalls of apples and bolts of calico, past the barrel of cider where young men jostled, past every whisper that followed her. Her boots pressed into the dirt road, steady and slow. Each step was a refusal. "I will not be your joke. I will not be your trade." At the edge of town, the noise of the fair dimmed. A wooden bridge crossed Willow Creek, its planks worn smooth by years of travelers. Clara paused, leaning on the rail, staring at the water, slipping past stones without complaint. The creek didn't judge, her body didn't weigh her worth against a pen of pigs. It simply mirrored her face in fragments of sunlight. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe, to exist without barter. And then a voice behind her, low and steady, carrying her name as if it still belonged somewhere. "Clara." She turned. By the cottonwood tree stood a man with dust on his boots and gentleness in his eyes. Thomas. A rancher she had known in another life, a man whose letters once reached her, but whose silence afterward had spoken louder. Now he stood watching her, as if he had been waiting all along. The creek whispered on. The fair behind her roared with laughter she refused to carry. And before her was a man who looked at her not as a bargain, but as a soul. Could this moment, after half a century of indignities, be the beginning of something different? Clara hadn't heard her name spoken with such care in decades. It startled her more than the insult of the fair. She turned slowly, as though afraid the sound might vanish if she moved too quickly. There he was, Thomas, broad-shouldered, weathered by sun and seasons, hat in hand, like a man stepping into a sacred place. His eyes met hers steady, not searching her for shame, not weighing her like livestock, but seeing her. "I saw what they tried to do," he said softly. The words carried no pity, only a quiet anger. "It won't stand." Clara gripped the bridge rail. She wanted to answer with dignity, but her throat tightened. It already stood, she managed. "But I'm not standing in it." Something flickered across his face respect. He took a step closer, careful as if nearing a skittish colt. Then he said the words she did not expect, words that would linger long after "you're worth more than gold." Her breath caught, not because of flattery she had been offered false sweetness before sugar that soured into cruelty, but because he said it plain like a fact written into the sky. Behind them the fair crackled with laughter, the clang of metal, the snort of animals. Yet on that bridge time slowed. Clara felt both exposed and strangely safe, as though she'd been plucked out of the crowd and placed gently back into her own skin. "Why would you say that?" she asked, her voice rough. "Because I know it," Thomas answered. He shifted his hat in his hands, the brim worn smooth by use. "And because someone needed to." They stood a moment in silence, the creek murmuring below. Finally he spoke again. "I have a place out by the ridge. It's quiet. Honest work, honest land. There's an extra room. Not pity, Clara, never pity. Just safety if you'd want it." Her first instinct was to refuse, to guard herself against kindness that might cost her more later. But she remembered the jeers at the pig pen, the sharp taste of humiliation still lingering. And she remembered his eyes when he spoke serious, unadorned. "You think the town will let that be?" she asked. "They'll whisper," Thomas admitted. "But whispers blow away. What stays is what we choose." The simplicity of it struck her. Not a grand rescue, not a claim, just an invitation to breathe somewhere new. Still old wounds tugged at her. "I've been taken in," before she said slowly. "Always ends with me carrying the heaviest load while being told I'm too much." Thomas nodded as if the confession was something to be honored, not dismissed. "Then you'll carry only what you choose. I'll see to the rest." For a long moment Clara stared at the current below water, sliding smooth over stone. Could she trust this? Could she trust herself? Finally she lifted her chin. "I will not be traded, but I will walk with you if your road is honest." His answer was steady. "It is. And if it ever strays, you'll tell me, and I'll listen." Something loosened in her chest, a knot untied by the simplest of promises, listening. So they left the bridge side by side back through the fairgrounds where the laughter still tried to mock her. But with Thomas at her shoulder, each step felt less like retreat and more like a declaration. By the time they reached his wagon, the sun was lowering into a copper sky. Clara climbed up, clutching her shawl, her heart trembling with something unfamiliar, not fear, not shame, but the first fragile echo of belonging. She didn't know yet what awaited on the ridge. She didn't know how much healing costs or how hard the whispers could bite. But she knew one thing: for the first time in years, she wasn't walking alone. Could a single sentence spoken with truth begin to rewrite an entire life? The road to the ridge was quiet, but Clara's heart was not. Each turn of the wagon wheel seemed to echo the whispers she imagined trailing behind them. She could almost hear the voices from the fair mocking, cruel, traded for pigs, taken in like charity. Too big, too late. Beside her, Thomas held the reins with calm steadiness. He didn't speak much, but every so often his glance would soften, as if to remind her she wasn't invisible. Yet silence has a way of stirring old ghosts, and hers were restless. When they reached his homestead, dusk had already pressed its violet hand across the prairie. The ranch house was plain, weathered wood, a porch sagging slightly, but it breathed of use of survival. Chickens rustled in the coop, and a single lantern glowed in the window. "Home," Thomas said simply, climbing down and offering his hand. Clara hesitated before taking it. Her palm, roughened by years of scrubbing and mending, rested against his, calloused but gentle. That touch, it was enough to remind her she was still flesh, not just a burden wrapped in cloth. Inside the house smelled of cedar and smoke. A table stood sturdy, worn by meals long past. On the mantel sat a small carved horse, its edges smoothed by time. It was a house shaped not by show, but by hands. "You'll take the room to the left," Thomas said, nodding toward a door. "Fresh linens. Might not be much, but it's yours." She thanked him, though her voice trembled, because already the whispers were rising again, not in his house, but in her chest. "They'll say you came begging. They'll say you're just another mouth to feed. They'll say he took you in because no one else would." That night, as the wind brushed against the shutters, Clara lay awake on the clean sheets. For the first time in years, she wasn't under someone's roof because of obligation or cruelty. Yet the weight of her past pressed down every insult, every rejection, Every time her worth had been measured in chores or shame. She pressed her hand against her chest and whispered to the dark, "Am I here because I was wanted or because I was convenient?" The next morning her fears were answered not with kindness but with cruelty. When Clara went to the well for water, two women from town stood by the fence baskets on their arms. They paused, their eyes sharp as needles. One whispered loud enough for her to hear, "Guess pigs aren't the only ones fattened at the Boone place." The other laughed. Clara froze. Her throat burned, but she kept her chin lifted, carrying the bucket as if it were a crown. Still, when she stepped inside, her knees shook. At supper, Thomas noticed. He didn't press, but finally asked, "What did they say?" "Nothing I haven't heard before," she murmured. He set his fork down, his gaze steady. "Then let me say what you haven't heard enough. You are not their joke. You're stronger than every word they'll ever throw." Her eyes stung, but she looked away. Strength was one thing, belonging was another. Could she truly claim either? In the days that followed, the conflict only deepened. Some townsfolk avoided her, others smirked openly. Even her own heart waged war between the walls she had built to survive and the small, stubborn seed of hope planted by Thomas's words. And late at night she lay awake wondering, if I trust this kindness, will it last? Or will it too be traded away when the laughter grows too loud? The prairie wind rattled the shutters like a reminder the storm inside her was far from over. Could dignity survive when the world insisted on mockery? Or would this fragile hope collapse under the weight of old wounds? The days stretched into a rhythm, dawn chores, meals at the rough-hewn table evenings, quiet beneath the lantern glow. Yet for Clara, peace felt fragile like glass that could shatter with one careless whisper. The townsfolk's cruelty still clung to her skin, but slowly something else began to rise, like a seed pressing through soil after a long winter. It happened one market day. Thomas had gone ahead to trade feed while Clara lingered at a stall choosing fabric to mend curtains. The murmurs began as expected. "She eats more than she sows." "Boone must be blind." Laughter followed sharp as spurs. This time, though, Clara did not hurry away. She turned, holding the fabric squarely in her hands, and faced the women. Her voice was calm but steady. "You speak as though my body is the only thing I bring into a room. But I have mended more than cloth in my life. I have kept children fed through winters. I have buried the dead with dignity when no one else would. I have survived what you couldn't name out loud." Silence spread uneasy. She placed her coins on the counter, took her fabric, and walked on. The women said nothing more. For the first time, their laughter didn't follow her. That night back at the homestead, Clara told none of it to Thomas, but he noticed the way she stood taller, as if some invisible chain had loosened. Later, as they shelled beans by the fire, Thomas spoke quietly. "You carry yourself different tonight." "I remembered something," Clara replied, eyes on the beans in her lap. "What's that that no one gets to name me but me?" The words hung between them, simple and sacred. Thomas leaned back, his gaze warm. "That's the truest thing I've heard in a long while." She dared to meet his eyes then, and in their depths she saw not charity, not obligation, but a steady respect. Something unspoken trembled between them like two weary travelers, recognizing the same long road in each other. In the weeks that followed, that seed of liberation grew. Clara began to hum softly while she worked a sound she hadn't heard from her own lips in years. She planted rosemary by the porch, not because anyone asked, but because she wanted the air to carry its strength. She baked bread and brought a loaf to the widow Halbert, the same woman who once called her a waste of a meal. The widow, stunned, accepted it with tears. And when Thomas saw her kneel in the dirt one afternoon, sleeves rolled, planting bulbs by the fence line, he said simply, "Looks like you're making this place yours." She wiped her hands on her apron, smiling faintly. "Maybe I am." That night something shifted. After supper, as they cleared the table, Thomas reached across and covered her hand with his rough, warm wordless. For a long moment Clara could not move. Her heart beat against every scar of humiliation she had carried. She was terrified not of him, but of what it might mean to believe. When she finally looked at him, his expression was steady. "You don't have to prove a thing here," he said. "You already belong." Her breath trembled. Years of silence, of being weighed and found lacking, cracked open at those words. For the first time in her life, she let herself whisper back, "Then maybe I can stay." and for once staying didn't feel like surrender. It felt like freedom. But could freedom last when the past still lingered at the edges of town, and when a letter soon to arrive would threaten the fragile home she was building? The spring thaw had come to Dry Hollow, turning the creeks restless and coaxing wildflowers out of the stubborn soil. At the Boone homestead, life settled into a rhythm that felt almost like peace. Clara worked with quiet purpose, mending, planting, cooking not because she was expected to, but because she wanted to. And Thomas steady as the hills matched her silence, with a presence that made the air itself feel less heavy. Yet peace has a way of stirring what has long been buried. It arrived in the form of a letter. The postman rode out one morning with a bundle tied in twine. Among the bills and seed catalogs, there was an envelope addressed in a hand that made Clara's stomach tighten. She knew it before she opened it. The letters leaned too heavily, as though written by someone always pressing down harder than they ought. Her brother-in-law, the man who had tried to barter her for pigs. The letter was short, bitter, scrawled in anger. You think you've risen above what you are. You belong where you came from, and you'll crawl back soon enough. Men don't keep women like you. They discard them when they've had their fill. Don't shame yourself further. Her hands shook, not because the words were new, but because they echoed every insult she had carried for decades. She folded the letter carefully, too carefully, as if controlling the paper might control the pain. But Thomas, who had been stacking wood nearby, noticed. Bad news, I've had worse, she said, tucking it into her apron pocket. That night, however, he found her on the porch, shoulders bent, staring at the hills. He stepped beside her, quiet as always. What did it say? Clara hesitated. She had spent a lifetime hiding shame, swallowing cruelty in silence. To speak it aloud felt dangerous. But she also knew silence had kept her small for too long. So she told him. Every word. How her brother-in-law tried to trade her, how she'd been treated as debt, how the letter claimed she was unworthy of being chosen. When she finished, the night was thick with crickets. She expected him to look away, maybe to agree with what the world had always said. Instead, Thomas's jaw tightened. I know something about being discarded, he said quietly. My wife died 10 winters back. Folks whispered I wasn't enough man to keep her alive. They said I let grief rot me from the inside. They weren't wrong about the grief it near hollowed me out. But I reckon people see wounds and call them weakness, when really it just means we've been asked to carry more. His voice was steady, but his hand trembled as he gripped the porch rail. It was the first time he had spoken of her. Clara looked at him, not with pity, but with recognition. So we're both the ones left behind, she murmured. He nodded. But that doesn't make us less. It just makes us still here. Something inside her cracked, but it wasn't despair, it was release. The truth laid bare between them like two weathered stones, no longer hiding their cracks. For years, Clara had carried the belief that her story was already written. Unwanted woman-tolerated burden, silent workhorse. But here with Thomas, she saw another possibility, that broken paths could become foundations, not chains. Still, the letter lay heavy in her apron pocket, its poison not entirely spent. And she knew the town had sharp eyes eager to reopen wounds. Could the fragile bond between two scarred souls survive when the world outside refused to let scars heal? Or would their pasts rise louder than the love just beginning to take root? The letter had been only ink, but words have a way of walking into a room, even when the writer is miles away. Within days, the whispers began again. At the mercantile, Clara caught the glances. At church, she heard the muted chuckles when her broad frame slipped into a pew. Someone had passed the words along about pigs, about shame, about her supposed place. By the following week, it was no longer whispers. It was a visit. 3 men rode up to the Boone homestead one afternoon, dust clouding behind their horses. Clara was weeding the rosemary patch when she saw them, faces she knew too well from the fair. One of them, her brother-in-law, sneered as he dismounted. Well, if it isn't the prize hog herself, he drawled. Guess Boone didn't know what he was feeding. Clara froze, but before she could answer, the door opened, and Thomas stepped out onto the porch. His stance was calm but iron steady, a man whose silence carried weight. You've said enough, he told them. The men laughed. We're just reminding her where she came from. Women like her, used goods, don't get to play lady of the house. Clara's breath shook. For years she had let such words bury her. She had walked away, endured, swallowed them like bitter medicine. But something in her, the same strength that had spoken at the fabric stall, rose higher now. She stood brushing dirt from her apron and faced them. "You call me a hog, a burden, a joke," she said, her voice trembling, but loud enough to carry. "But I have lived through more winters than your cruelty ever could. I have kept houses when men abandoned them. I have borne humiliation and still stood upright. And I will not," her chin lifted, "I will not leave this place because your pride can't stomach my dignity." For a moment, even the horses stilled. The brother-in-law sneered again, but his eyes flicked nervously toward Thomas, who had stepped down from the porch, now standing shoulder to shoulder with Clara. "She stays," Thomas said, his voice low as thunder. "And if you think to call her less than she is, you'll answer to me." The silence stretched taut as a pulled rope. Finally, the men spat curses, mounted their horses, and rode off in a spray of dust. Clara's knees weakened, but Thomas's hand was already there, steady against her back. Inside by the fire, she trembled, not from fear, but from release. "I've never spoken like that," she whispered. "Never once. I thought, if I stayed quiet, I could survive." Thomas's eyes were soft. "Quiet keeps you breathing, but speaking keeps you alive." She met his gaze, then tears threatening. "Do you really believe I belong here?" He didn't answer with words. Instead, he took her hand, the hand that had mended, that had carried, that had been mocked for its size, and held it as though it were gold. "You're more than belonging," he said finally. "You're chosen." And for the first time, Clara believed it might be true. But outside the windows, the prairie wind carried the echo of hooves. Conflict wasn't gone. It had only ridden off to wait. The past, the town, the sharp tongues of men, none of them had finished their say. Would this fragile love endure the storm that still gathered on the horizon? Or would Clara and Thomas have to fight once more for the right simply to stand together? Summer stretched across Dry Hollow, painting the hills in gold and the skies in endless blue. For the first time in decades, Clara woke each morning not with dread, but with a quiet expectancy. She tied her apron, stoked the fire, and stepped into the day with hands that no longer trembled from shame, but worked in rhythm with belonging. The echoes of her brother-in-law's taunts still lingered in town, but something had shifted. After the confrontation, folks seemed to look at her differently. Maybe it was the way she'd stood tall in the dirt, refusing to bow. Maybe it was how Thomas had stood beside her, not as savior, but as equal. Whispers still existed, but so did nods of respect, small, hesitant, but real. One morning, Mrs. Halbert came by with a jar of honey. She set it down awkwardly, her eyes lowered. "For the bread you brought," she murmured. It wasn't an apology, not in words, but Clara felt it in the tremble of the woman's hands. She accepted with a gentle smile. Healing often arrived quietly in fragments like this. Inside the homestead, life softened. Clara planted lavender by the porch. Thomas built a bench beneath the elm. Some evenings they sat there side by side, watching the horizon burn orange as the sun dipped. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. Their silences were no longer empty. They were full, like the pause before a hymn's last note. One evening, Thomas brought out a small box, carved from walnut edges, smoothed by years of use. He placed it on the table before her. Inside was no diamond, no polished trinket. Instead, a plain gold band, worn but steady. "I've nothing fancy to give," he said, his voice rough but steady. "Only my days, my land, and what's left of my heart. But if you'll stay, not because you must, but because you choose, I'd be the richer man." Clara's breath caught. The girl she once had been traded like cattle, mocked for her weight, discarded as too much. Too late, she rose inside her, trembling. And then the woman she had become, seasoned, scarred yet unbroken, answered. She slid the ring onto her finger. "You don't have to give me riches, Thomas," she whispered. "You already gave me back myself." He covered her hand with his, and for a long moment the house was hushed, holding its breath around them. That winter, no invitations were sent, no choir sang. There was no white gown, no crowd to watch. Instead, one frost-tipped morning, Clara moved her shawl and Bible into the main room, hung her apron beside his on the hook, and set her bread to rise in the same hearth where Thomas warmed his coffee. It was enough. The town came to know them differently in time. Not as the joke, not as the widow with too much flesh, not as the rancher, too broken by grief. but as two people who had chosen each other when no one else dared. And sometimes the strongest vows are those lived quietly through chores, shared storms, weathered in hands that hold fast. Years later, folks would say that when you passed the Boone place at dusk, you could see a lantern glowing steady in the window, smell rosemary and fresh bread, and hear laughter, soft, low, but certain. And they would say it was Clara's laughter that made that house a home again. Because in the end, she had not been traded for pigs. She had not been discarded. She had been seen, cherished, and chosen. And that she realized was worth more than gold. So perhaps the question is not whether love comes early or late, but whether when it finally arrives, we are brave enough to believe it's real. In the end, Clara was not remembered as the woman once traded for pigs. She was remembered as the woman who chose to stand tall, who stayed gentle when the world was cruel, and who finally believed the words of a man who saw her clearly, "You're worth more than gold." Her story reminds us of something we all need to hear, especially as the years pass. No one's value can be measured by age, appearance, or what others whisper. True worth lies in dignity, in kindness, in the quiet courage to keep living with an open heart. And sometimes love doesn't come early. Sometimes it comes late, just when we're finally ready to receive it. Dear friends, perhaps that is something we can all carry into our own lives, that we are never too old, too late, or too much to be chosen. If this story touched you, I invite you to subscribe to None, Wild West Saga, so you won't miss the next tale of healing and second chances. Share this video with someone who might need to be reminded that they too are worth more than gold. And before you go, tell us in the comments, would you like to see what happens next for Clara and Thomas as they build their life together? Or would you like to hear another story of quiet strength and late bloom love? Your words matter here. We read everyone.